Hello students and welcome to Finance for Engineers course. Students, in earlier lecture, we had discussion concerned with cost of equity and its computation. Over there, we discussed about the cost of equity, that is, the minimum rate of return that a firm must pay to the equity shareholders. Then we discussed about the various approaches used for computing cost of equity by the firm. Over there, the first one was dividend yield approach, then dividend growth method, and earnings yield method. We understood that under dividend yield approach, assumed that company has stable earning and stable dividend over a period of time, and thus it helps us to understand the cost of equity. Then under dividend growth method, we assume that the dividend is growing year by year and uh, based on expected growth in dividend, we compute cost of equity. Then by using earning yield method, earning per share is the main component for calculating or computing cost of equity. Today, we are going to discuss about the cost of retained earnings. Retained earnings refer to undistributed profit of a firm. See, we know that out of the total earning, firms generally distribute only a part of them in the form of dividend, and the rest will be retained with the firms. Since no dividend is required to be paid on retained earnings, some people feel that retained earnings carry no cost. But this approach is not appropriate. Retained earnings has the opportunity cost of dividends foregone by the investors. The rate of return that could have been earned by investors by investing dividends in alternative investment becomes the cost of retained earnings. Hence, shareholders expect a return on retained earnings at least equal to cost of equity. However, while calculating cost of retained earnings, two adjustments should be made. First is income tax adjustment, as the shareholders are to pay some income tax out of dividend, and next adjustment is concerned with brokerage cost, as the shareholders should incur or they have to incur some brokerage cost while investing dividend income. After these adjustments, calculating or computing cost of retained earnings. The formula is KR is equal to KE into bracket 1 minus T into 1 minus B. So where KR is equal to cost of retained earnings, KE is cost of equity, T is rate of tax, and B is cost of purchasing new securities or brokerage cost. So let us see an example concerning to calculation of retained earnings. Concerning to calculation of cost of retained earnings. So here it is an example, a firm cost of equity KE is 18%. The average income tax rate of shareholders is 30%, and brokerage cost of 2% is expected to be incurred while investing their dividend in alternative securities. Compute the cost of retained earnings. So all the information necessary or required to calculate the cost of retained earnings is given, and now by applying formula we will calculate the cost of retained earnings. So here is the formula, and KE, that is cost of equity, is given 18%, so it is 18. Then 1 minus T, that is tax rate, it is given 30%. And then 1 minus B, that is brokerage, again it is given as a 2%. So by this way, we solve the equation, and here KR is equal to 12.35%. That is cost of retained earnings in this particular example is 12.35%. So in this way, we can compute the cost of retained earnings, where we are considering two important adjustments, that is of income tax and brokerage cost, that is incurred by the shareholder. Now, the next is weighted average cost of capital. It is the average of the cost of various sources of financing. It is also known as composite or overall or average cost of capital. After computing the cost of individual sources of finance, the weighted average cost of capital is calculated by putting weights in the proportion of the various sources of funds to the total. Weighted average cost of capital is calculated by using either of the following two types of weight. First is market value weight, and second is book value weight. Market value weights are sometimes preferred to the book value weight. Why? Because the market value represents the true value of the investor. But however, it suffers from certain limitations. They are: first is market values are subject to frequent fluctuation, and second is equity capital gets more important with the use of market value weight. Moreover, book values are readily available. Now the next is formula. This is the formula used for computing weighted average cost of capital. Here, KW is weighted average cost of capital. X represent cost of specific source of finance, and W is weight, that is the proportions of specific sources of finance in the total. Let us see an example concerning to computation of weighted average cost of capital. So from the following capital structure and after tax cost from different sources of funds, compute the weighted average cost of capital of a firm. So this is the information given. You can see three columns here: sources of funds, amount, and after tax cost of capital. In a sources of funds, they have given information concerned with the capital structure, that is, from which sources the firm has raised funds, that is, equity capital, retained earnings, preference share capital, debentures. Then, in the amount column, they have given corresponding amount to the sources of funds, that is, equity capital 4,50,000, retained earnings 1,50,000, preference share capital 1 lakh, debentures 3 lakh. Thus, the firm has raised total amount 10 lakh by these sources. Then the next information is given concerned with the cost of capital. If it is seen in a percentage, it is 14%, 13%, 10%, and 5%. So by using this information now, we will compute the weighted average cost of capital. So let us solve this example. Computation of weighted average cost of capital, and here is the table concerning to the same. You can see two more columns added here, that is proportion and weighted average cost of capital. The first column is sources of funds. As it is, we have mentioned the same information, whatever is given in an example. That is all the sources written here. Then amount column. After that, the column is concerned with proportion. Here we have to calculate proportion of equity capital to the total. By this way, we calculated and we got 0.45, then 0.15, 0.10 and 0.30 to the total source of fund or total amount. Then after tax cost of capital is already given in an example. We have converted that in a percentage. And next column is concerning to weighted average cost of capital. You can see here the equity capital weighted average cost is 6.30. For retained earnings, it is 1.95. For preference share, it is 1. For debentures, it is 1.50. So how to calculate this weighted average cost of capital? For calculating weighted average cost of capital, the formula used is proportion into the cost of capital. Here we have already calculated the proportion of a particular source of fund to the total. So 0.45 into 14% gives us 6.30. Then weighted average cost of retained earnings can be calculated by multiplication of 0.15 into 13%. It gives us 1.95. Then 0.10 into 10%, and weighted average cost of capital of preference share is 1. For debenture, it is 0.30 into 5% gives us 1.50. So by this way, we calculated the weighted average cost of capital, and now the total weighted average cost of capital is 10.75. So in this way, one can compute the weighted average cost of capital. Now, for better understanding, we will see another example. Following are the details regarding the capital structure of a company. And this is the information given to us. You can see here one more additional column is given in this particular example. So let us see what are the columns. First is sources of funds. Next is book value. Then third one is market value. And the last one, fourth one is cost of capital. That means here they have given various sources of funds. Along with that, they have given information concerned with book value of these sources of funds. Then they have given information concerned with market value of all these sources of funds, and then the cost of these sources. So, which we have seen in the theoretical part, that is the weighted average cost of capital can be calculated by using two different types, book value method and a market value method or weight. So the same thing we will apply here for solving this particular example. So here you are required to determine the weighted average cost of capital using book value weight and market value weight. So let us see how to solve this example. So first we will compute the weighted average cost of capital by using book value weight. So you can see here As like earlier example, we have calculated proportion, then multiplied that proportion with the cost of capital, and we able to compute the weighted average cost of capital. So here first we have to create a table containing 5 columns. First will be the sources of fund, which is already given in an example. Then the second column, amount, that is the book value given in an example. Then we computed proportion of equity capital to the total capital, then retained earnings, preference share capital, debentures to the total capital, and then cost of capital already given in an example. So now we have to just multiply this proportion with the cost of capital to calculate or to compute weighted average cost of capital. So you can find here 5.98 in case of equity capital, retained earnings 1.35, for preference share capital 0.64, and debentures 1.55. So by this way, the total weighted average cost of capital by using this book value weight is 9.52. Now we will see computation of weighted average cost of capital by using market value weight. In the same manner, we will create a table with 5 columns: sources of funds, amount, proportion, cost of capital, and weighted average cost of capital. So here you can see in a amount column, now we have written market value given in the example. But one important thing happening here is, in the example, they have given equity capital market value 12 lakh, but while solving, we have distributed that amount, and we have written 9 lakh as an equity capital and 3 lakh as a retained earnings. So why it is so? Because here we have done market value of equity and retained earnings proportion taking a base of book value. So what is the base here? We have considered here calculation shown. Market value of equity is calculated 12 lakh into 6 by 8, that is 9 lakh, and market value of retained earnings is equal to 12 lakh into 2 by 8 is equal to 3 lakh. So this is already we have used, or they have given in an example. In case of book value, if you see the proportion of book value, the same we have taken as a base and used for doing a proportion or finding the market value of equity and retained earnings. And by this way, once we completed the market value identification of this equity and retained earnings, we able to compute the proportion of equity capital, retained earnings, preference share capital, debenture in a total funds raised by the organization. Cost of capital is already given in an example. So just by multiplication of weighted average cost of capital, be able to calculate or compute the total weighted average cost of capital of the various sources of a given organization by using market value weight. So you can see here 6.89 is for equity capital, retained earnings 1.53, preference share capital 0.56, debentures 1.15, and thus the total weighted average cost of capital is 10.13. So by this way, one can compute the weighted average cost of capital by using book value weight and market value weight. So students, till here we have completed important part of the unit, that is the cost of capital, which is very significant while taking any financing decision. Now you must have understood what is the cost of capital. It is nothing but the minimum rate of return a firm must earn on its investment. Yes, definitely it is a complex and controversial but very significant concept in financial management that plays a crucial role in all the financial decisions. We have seen that the computation of cost of capital involves computation of specific cost of capital and then the computation of weighted average cost of capital. So in this unit, we have learned the computation of cost of specific capitals like equity, preference, retained earnings, and debt, and also the weighted average cost of capital. So now I'm ending my session here. Thank you.